Great.
Hi, Alon. How are you?
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody to this discussion about Israel's growth and population, part of a series of conversations we at JTA News, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, have been having for Israel's 75th anniversary. We're joined today by two distinguished panelists, Professor Sergio Della Pergola. You can give a wave, and Professor Alon Tal. They're both professors, but they have a lot more to their bios. My name is Uri Heilman. I work at JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and its parent company, 70 Faces Media, and we're so glad that you can all come and join this important conversation about Israel's future growth and population. I just want to quickly tell you a little bit more about our panelists, starting with Professor Della Pergola. Sergio Della Pergola is a professor emeritus and former chairman of Hebrew University's Harman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry. He was born in Italy and has been living in Israel since 1966, although today he's talking to us from Italy. He is one of the world's leading Jewish demographers, if not the leading demographer, and the author of such books as Israel and Palestine, The Power of Numbers, Jewish Population and Identity, Concept and Reality, and Diaspora versus Homeland. He's lectured at over 100 universities on 5 continents and is the winner of numerous awards, including the Michael Landau Prize for Demography and Migration. We're also joined by Professor and former Knesset member Alon Tal. Welcome, Alon, one of Israel's leading environmentalists who served in the Israeli Knesset from 2021 to 2022 as a member of the Blue and White Party. Professor Tal's career has been a balance between academia and public interest advocacy. As a Knesset member, he was chair of the Knesset Subcommittee on Environment, Climate, and Health. And from 2010 to 2013, he was the chair of Israel's Green Party. Now, this semester, he's a visiting professor of business and sustainability at Stanford University, though his permanent post is at Tel Aviv University's Department of Public Policy. He's the founder of several environmental organizations, including Adam Teva V'Din, the Israel Union for Environmental Defense, and the Arava Institute. He's presently the co-chair of Tzafuf, the Israel Forum for Population, Environment, and Society. He has written or edited 11 books, including The Land is Full, addressing overpopulation in Israel, which is particularly pertinent to our topic today. So I want to turn first to Professor Della Pergola, if you will, to just give us a sense of the numbers of where Israel is today, what the population trend lines are, and where it's growing. But before I do so, I also want to mention what it feels like to live in a country of such fertile population and such rapid growth. This is a country where every day the traffic gets a little worse. The trains are so beyond capacity that when I recently interviewed the director of marketing of the Israel trains, he said, we actually don't want to market the trains because they're already over capacity. We just want to use the marketing budget to tell people to behave themselves on trains and know when to get off and when to get on. Development is swallowing up a lot of the open land around cities. To accommodate the dead in Israel, cemeteries are not just sprawling out, but going up. People are being buried in the air like they're in parking garages and in subterranean caverns, particularly in the hills around Jerusalem. We have a holiday coming up, Shavuot, in a couple of days. And one of the new traditions of Israeli holidays is that the nature sites and beaches are sometimes so overrun that the radio broadcasters tell people that urge the public to stay away, there's no more room. And I can tell you from experience that my kids' classrooms are not just at capacity, but over capacity. So that's how it feels on the ground. Sergio, tell us a little bit about what the numbers look like.
Well, I'll start with a short autobiographical note. I came to Jerusalem in 1966, as you mentioned, as a young doctoral student, having completed my master's in an Italian university. And in fact, the The true motive was on one hand to study and to know the country, which I had visited already several times, but also to realize a dream that is the dream of many of us younger people who wanted to live in Israel and give life to the state of the Jews and have this wonderful experience. So it was really self-realization and hoping in a better future and learning. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem, of course, as an excellent school. I was admitted in the doctoral program in demography and contemporary Jewish studies. And this is what I've done basically since my first day in Israel. I am a very fortunate guy who got a little scholarship and then was appointed assistant and up to full professor and professor emeritus as I am. I'm saying this to stress the fact that first and foremost, people come to Israel to live an experience and hopefully they enjoy and they make it. Of course, gradually they come to know the country, its complexity, its politics, its population trends, and also its density, which unquestionably you have already noted some of its features. So it's part of a very big flow. In 1948, when Israel got its independence, the numbers were very small, several hundred thousands. There were basically 600,000 or 700,000 Jews out of the population of the then new state of Israel. We have to understand that Israel covered then one part of the British mandate on Palestine. The United Nations General Assembly on 29 November 1947 had voted to have two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And Israel was born on what was supposed to be the territory of the Jewish state. I will not now, of course, reconstruct the wars and other events, but the fact is that that was a population that immediately started absorbing Jewish immigrants, survivors from the Shoah, the Holocaust, and then immediately later, many Jews from Muslim countries who had to leave basically totally deprived of anything, those lands. Since then, the country's population has grown by a factor of 11 or 12, and it is now, if you include the state of Israel, without the Palestinian territories, I have to stress, but including Jews and non-Jews, Arabs and Christians and Druze, in the boundaries of the state of Israel, we have now passed the 9.5 million mark. We shall approach soon 10 million. So from less than 1 million to 10 million, this is quite remarkable. But besides the numbers, the more remarkable thing is the immigration and absorption and integration of such a huge mosaic of different people coming from all continents, with very big gaps in terms of their socioeconomic training and capabilities and resources. And the attempt, which is still going on, not yet completed, to create a more homogeneous and more viable society, which can hopefully give answers to many and their very different needs.
You mentioned immigration as one of the sources of, or the major source of Israeli growth. Israel also has a fertility rate that is far outpaces any other country, any other Western country in Europe or the United States. I think, Alon, you've written in your book that it's more akin to the fertility rate in Mexico. And it's not just among Haredim and Arabs, right? This is also among secular Israelis.
Well, that's correct. Israel's birth rates are unprecedented. But let me start by saying, first of all, correcting one thing. I think that Professor de la Perga is the unquestioned expert on demography in the Jewish world and Israel in general. And it's an honor to be up here. I always feel when I appear, and every so often we get to sit together, I learn quite a bit. We don't always agree, but it's really, everybody should feel privileged that we're talking to one of the giants of Israeli academia. Now, the truth of the matter is that the Israeli fertility levels are a function, I think, of a series of historic and cultural circumstances which led our people, to my mind, with some justification, when the state was established, to have a demographic policy which prioritized increasing the population. 1 out of every 3 Jews was killed during the Holocaust. When we arrived in Israel, our sovereignty over the small sliver of land which we were given was hardly recognized by the international community. We needed to establish demographic facts. And so our population grew both as a result of the fact that Jews like large families, and then the government, as the state evolved, began to give small subsidies. Later they grew and they shrank a little bit, but has generally had a very pro-natal policy that encouraged people to have children through economic incentives and through a national narrative which says we need to grow stronger and bigger, and to be a patriot in Israel, you need to have more children. And I would want to say that that policy, as a professor of public policy, I think was a rational and well-founded policy through most of Israel's history. When I started writing about this issue about 15 years ago, and more intensely in the last 5-6 years, I began to be concerned because as the, how should I put, the geographic circumstances and the demographic circumstances of Israel began to change, it didn't seem like there was any shift in the public policies. And I think that that'll be maybe one of the things we'll get to, but certainly our birth rate in Israel is a result of both nationalistic, but also cultural, and the fact I have 3 children, and the reason I get up in the morning, Jewish families and Arab families, Israeli Arabs, prioritize the family unit, and that's a good thing. So
obviously population growth for many countries is an engine of economic growth. We've seen that countries in Europe that are losing population are desperate to find more bodies. China's rescinded not only its one-child policy, but it's trying to encourage people to have 2 or more children, to great challenge. In Israel, the population growth has led to, or has helped sustain, an economic boom. A real estate boom. To help us understand where this becomes a problem, aside from the cosmetic things that I mentioned at the outset of this conversation about traffic and crowded parks and things like that.
So first of all, I think it's an elephant in the room, but we have to realize that the economic implications of Israel's demographic growth have changed insofar as the communities that are growing the fastest and really beginning to show increase in percentages are not necessarily those who are making the greatest contribution to the economy. And that's something which we recognize. I think Professor Dan Ben David from my department at Tel Aviv University writes about this extensively, about the importance of, it's a separate realm of creating educational policies which ensure that the ultra-Orthodox population, that the Arab and Bedouin population receive the training that they need to integrate into this post-industrial economy. But the truth of the matter is that there are areas where when you have shortfalls in infrastructure, where it takes people so long to get to work. Now, working remotely to some extent can overcome it, but there are areas where that begins to affect economic outcome. Typically, though, when we think about the negative impacts of the high density in Israel, it's more about quality of life than so, would say the overall prosperity or per capita GNP. That may be affected down the road. I don't think it has yet. Perhaps Sergio has a different perspective. I don't think we're seeing damage to maybe tourism might drop in the future, but I'm not so sure that we've seen a negative impact from over there.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor Della Pergola, when you think about Israel's population growth and the trend lines, Professor Tal mentioned the growth of the Haredim is the primary engine of Jewish growth, but not the only one. Looking ahead 1 decade, 2 decades to Israel's 100th birthday, what might the state look like? How will it be different?
Well, first of all, another word about some historical perspective, because as I mentioned, the Jewish people, which stands at the roots of the constitution and development of the state of Israel, was very highly dispersed and very heterogeneous, including parts in highly developed countries and parts in less developed countries. Jews in Europe before World War II were already reaching a very low level of fertility and aging, and was prominent, and that there was a beginning of decline. If you take German Jewry, before the Nazi regime did what it did, and other countries. After the creation of Israel, one of the most interesting features sociologically has been a significant convergence between the different communities of origin. And so in a sense, beyond Ashkenazim and Sfaradim and Mizrahim, as we call them today, there has emerged a sort of Israeli pattern, which then, when compared with other countries of similar economic development, turns to have probably the highest level of fertility of OECD countries as an average. And so this is quite extraordinary. Of course, this has to be explained. And the explanation partly comes from religiosity. That is, of course, if we rate the different variables that stand behind the relatively high Jewish fertility, just to mention today that the currently born average is about 3, slightly above 3 or slightly less, depending on years. And by the way, within the state of Israel, interestingly, over the last very few years, there has been convergence between Jews and Arabs within the boundaries of the state of Israel. So that's interesting, because there is heterogeneity. And of course, the most religious, as we know, have much bigger families. It can be double or even more than that, 6 or 7 children on average among the Haredim, that is the faithful. And to me, though, the most interesting chapter is the fertility of the Chilonim, of the secular. If I take the administrative division of Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv County, so to call it, I find total fertility which is slightly above 2 or slightly above. And in fact, Tel Aviv is the most secular part of Israel, hedonistic, anti-conformist. I mean, there is a lot of tolerance. It's a highly cultural city, open to all innovation. There are alternative forms of family formation, which are very diffused. And yet, the number of children is higher than among any European country, including the religious in those countries, and including the United States of America, which is quite amazing. It means that the quest for children is not only a product of religiosity and traditionalism, but it runs somewhat deeper in the vein of the Jewish people. Now, the question whether this is a remnant of the Holocaust is interesting. I have a very different explanation, but I can mention the alternative. Wishing to replenish our numbers after the tragedy, or the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and therefore having babies for the army, for the prime minister, for the chief of staff. I mean, these are theories, but I don't think these theories are substantiated by social research. As far as I have conducted significant research on the determinants of fertility, I've come to something which has been even a little bit surprising for me. But the real reason why Jewish families have children, by the way, a point I mentioned, the average is 3. But if you ask how many you would like to have, the average, substantively and with a lot of stability, since the 1970s, survey after survey, the number is 4. That is, Israelis have on the average 1 child less than they would like to have, although the country has changed so dramatically from a very simple and under-industrialized country to a very sophisticated high-tech exporter. And so there is this kind of stability which has to be explained. And the explanation certainly has cultural roots. It is much beyond the macro. It goes into the intimacy of the couple. When we did a very big survey about why have another child or why have a child at all, the answer was because it is good for me and my partner. It is good for me, my partner, and my kids. That is, the answers are micro-social and not the big ideological theories as we might have it. So it is very rooted, and it is therefore very sincere and in a sense very mainstream. to love the classic nuclear family with adults and kids. I repeat, in spite of the innovation and modernization of family structures, which is visible in Israel and especially Tel Aviv, of course. So that's an interesting point. Of course, there is the matter of family resources, which is crucial. And here, maybe someone will be disappointed because we usually tend to think that the richer have fewer children and the more educated have smaller families. But this is not true. The truth of the matter is that provided you wish to have a child, if you have the resources, you can allow that to yourself and your family. If you don't, you won't. And therefore, the tendency is for richer and better educated families today, including those with working women and career women, to have larger families than those who have poorer standards of income. Of course, again, keeping into account the fact that the very religious are usually the poorer strata of society, and they tend to have the biggest family. So it is a very complex equation. And I conclude this by saying that attempts to elaborate policies, which are welcome and needed, have to keep in mind the propensities of the population and also eventually the parliamentary majority, which will be able to pass certain reforms. Certainly, we are not China. And the Knesset, of which Alon was a very respected member, much to my liking, I don't think the Knesset has the tools and the majority to vote the single child policy that China imposed until recently, because it has changed upon its citizens.
So, Professor Tal, I'd love to have you respond to that. If you see the reasons for the high fertility rate in the same way as Professor Della Pergola, and what role does government possibly have here in stabilizing the population?
Okay, well, the truth of the matter is that I agree with him generally that the decision to have a child is very, very much linked to individual circumstances and one's expectation about what it's going to do. Not always, but most of the time people have more children because they believe it will make them happy. And one of the things that we think about in this organization, Safuf, that I established, is how do we create I would call it a line, we call it hasbara, I don't want to say propaganda, but explaining to the public that in fact, the world shows, we see it in Israel too, that actually smaller families tend to be happier. Very large families suffer from increased juvenile delinquency and dropouts, and the divorce rate is higher. And there's all kinds of social reasons why 2 or 3 children is preferable. And this we know from surveys. The public doesn't always understand that, something which we can do a better job of. But having said that, we did see twice in Israel's history when by the way, our child allowances are not that high by world standards, but even the Bibi Netanyahu, when he was the finance minister in 2003, slashed it by 50%. We did see a mild drop, at least the Palestinian, the Arab-Israeli population, particularly the Bedouins, and even the ultra-Orthodox. There's some studies that suggest maybe they went from 7 to 6. It was a very short-lived because those were there. But there is, having spoken to many, many ultra-Orthodox families and Israelis in general, few would ever admit that economics is a reason for having a smaller family. But in the same context, I agree with Professor Della Pergola. When somebody's thinking about the fact that they're having a hard time buying the extra pair of shoes for their child, providing them the special care they need, and then they think about bringing another child, having more money makes a difference. I would say this, and I think it's more of a cultural, social thing. We do know that in ultra-Orthodox families where both members have an academic degree, they have lower numbers of children. I think I saw a study that said 4.2, 4.3, which is still a very large family size, but it's significantly smaller than their neighbors. So at some level, providing educational opportunities will bring them into the mainstream. If you remember, Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize for Economics because of his insights into why in this case, in the world, wealthier families tend to have fewer children. It has to do with the opportunity costs. And although it doesn't work like that in Israel, and Sergey is absolutely right, but I think to the extent that we could create the dynamics in which there is a trade-off between having a larger family and maybe professional satisfaction, or certainly, then I think that we might have an easier job. But it's not going to be a simple thing. I think public policy certainly accelerated the increase in Israeli fertility. Turning it back is going to be a challenge, but I think we can do it, and I think we will do it. I think the reality will do it.
And do you think that turning it back, we're going to see the shrinking number, the shrinking growth in the Haredi sector more than we might see it in the secular sector, which is the kind of, the backbone of the Israeli economy, really?
Well, first of all, the Haredi sector has more to drop. When you start at 7 or 7.2 or whatever the number is, if you drop, I don't think that the secular community, which is also about almost 3, I think, if I've seen most of the numbers, is going to drop. We've seen something very interesting, and I agree about this convergence. When the Soviet Union collapsed and many Jews came over there, most of them were in a society where the norm was to have one child, and their children are having the same number of children as other secular Israelis for the most part. There's certain norms about the way this works. So, but I don't think that the secular community is going to change. I am concerned for other reasons that many secular Israelis may leave, and they are the backbone of economics. And I have 2 daughters. One is doing a PhD in Yale. The other one is working in climate tech in Seattle. I desperately want them to come home to Israel. I know that all my friends have children who are with life outside the country, and to offer them a quality of life and a economic horizon which can compete with the West, I think we have to address the demographic issue, because the extent to which we're going to become more and more crowded and more taxes are going to support communities that don't have the ability to contribute to the kind of economy. This is a disincentive for people to come home, or these stronger people, or for high-tech companies to stay in Israel, et cetera. So I think it is linked to a broader picture in terms of the future.
Speaking of out-migration and immigration to Israel, Professor Del Pergel, you mentioned that in the early years of the state, obviously, Israel took in huge numbers of immigrants, so much so that it overwhelmed the housing capacity of the state, and people were living in tents for months or even years until the Ma'abarot were erected. And over the course of Israel's history, there have been these huge waves of immigration. But in the last 10 or 20 years, really since the Soviet Union fell and there was a large Russian immigration, we haven't really seen a huge wave. There's been, certain large numbers of Ethiopian immigrants. Over the last year and a half or so, we've seen larger numbers of Russian immigrants, but nothing that really parallels what we saw in the past. Where's the balance today between people who are emigrating, leaving Israel, and people who are coming in? And is Aliyah, immigration to Israel, one of the drivers of Israel's population growth today?
Well, of course, Aliyah and immigration was a huge economic driver, as already mentioned. In my work, although as I mentioned, and also as Alon Tal, we are all immigrants, and your father, Uriel, who is a well-known academic and a friend. We came on immigration, and most of us had, of course, good intellectual and sort of ideological reasons. Some of us were even active in Jewish youth movements. But beyond that, in my work, I have reached the conclusion that migration movements to and from Israel have to be analyzed in a strictly pragmatic way, that is looking at the socioeconomic factors that motivate most international migration. In that sense, Israel is a case study which is not so different from others, although of course it is exceptional because of the conditions of those who came. And so the fluctuations of the Israeli economy, which has been doing very well, but of course has had better and worse moments, are behind the numbers of those who leave. In general, nearly year after year, during 75 years, the number of immigrants has been much bigger than the number of those who left. I mean, the migration balance is spectacularly big in the sense toward Israel. But there have been, of course, waves when, for example, unemployment was high in Israel, or when inflation was unbearable in Israel. And I have to stress these economic factors, which are shared with other countries, overwhelmingly dominate vis-a-vis other possible determinants, such as the impact of wars as such, or other cultural factors. Wars sometimes had a very beneficial impact on the economy, such as after the Six-Day War. So there was an economic boom. And the Yom Kippur War in 1973 had a very negative impact on the economy. So this then impacts migration. But migration in general, and this is again maybe a surprise to some in the audience, has been declining all the time in terms of the relative impact of migration relative to the total population in Israel. In fact, during recent years, until the COVID epidemic, because the epidemics, of course, is a factor of rupture, which has still to be assessed completely. But the per thousand or percent of Israelis who left during the last years was declining, and in fact, it reached the historical minimum a few years ago. I'm sorry. So very much is also explained in terms of immigration. Rates of unemployment abroad and in Israel can be considered a very powerful explanatory factor. And so it depends, therefore, very much on what economic policies and what economic situation we have in this country to be able to predict what will be the future. Of course, I'm sorry.
As you catch your breath, I just wanted to ask you, so how does currently or before COVID, let's say 2019, the number of people leaving Israel, is it greater or less than the number of people who are immigrating to Israel?
Absolutely smaller, but significantly smaller. Also, taking into account the fact that many return. Professor Tal already mentioned a specific case, and of course, there has been a lot of attention to who leaves. Are they the more educated or the poorer? Of course, there has been a tendency in recent years to witness a very significant brain drain from Israel. Israel, we must say, and I think Alon and me, we can be proud, we at our universities train very good people. We had good universities and we train good people, but the catch is that these very good people are very competitive in the international market, and therefore they are required, and they can easily find a placement on markets in the United States, Canada, Australia, or Western Europe. And so, but in any case, no question about the prominence of immigration over the numbers of those who left. However, of course, if the economy in Israel, and unfortunately, we are now in the midst of a very tough discussion. We have, by the way, tomorrow the Israeli Knesset must approve the new budget, which is quite a crucial step. And probably Professor Tal and myself share a lot of concern about the priorities that the current budget will take. And there are, I will not enter the details, but there is a prioritization of certain aspects which tend to be quite clientelistic rather than looking at the real interest of the future development of Israeli society in terms of development and higher education. And so if for bad chance, Israel gets into a recession, a very big and prolonged recession, there is no question that the number of immigrants and high quality immigrants will increase. And therefore, from here, the responsibility of the Israeli government to have policies which look at the broad interest of Israeli society, also from the optics of the migration balance.
Professor Tal, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the role that the Israeli government can play here, both for good and for ill.
Well, I again believe that while I certainly agree with Celia, we don't want to become China, but I do think the government can send very clear signals to the public about what it's, and as I said, For many years, I believe there was a compelling national interest to encourage large families. At this point, when I think about the government, I think the government often said we have to start pulling back on some of these incentives. And it's not just the child allowances, that's a smaller part. It is, it appears in all kinds of life, from the second you leave the hospital, even beforehand, you get special support, and it continues all the time that you have large families. And I think that has to change. People often say to me, well, why do you want the government to be involved in people's personal, most intimate decisions on how many children they're having? Don't you think that's inappropriate? I said, on the contrary, I want to get the government out of the Israeli bedroom. I want the government to let citizens make their choices based on their economic circumstances and their values and personal priorities. So let's start by saying that first government policy has to be is the willingness to tell the public honestly that we grew very quickly, tenfold in 75 years. If we grow tenfold in another 75 years, which is unlikely because I don't think, but it's conceivable. You could imagine a scenario. Israel will be an impossible place to live. And I would argue that even with 2025 living, inside of Israel, we would have a quality of life would be diminished. So I think they're starting to say that is one thing. Now, when I was a member of Knesset, I was not silent on this issue. I was advised by many friends, listen, this is very sensitive, it's very charged. You probably shouldn't talk about this issue. But I was of the opinion that all of my recent environmental advocate, I have highlighted this issue, and it would be disingenuous to sort of hide a feeling about it. And I'm very grateful that I have a political party which doesn't necessarily agree with Alon Tal, everything demographically, but felt that it was okay to give me latitude to speak. And I gave several speeches about this, and also met with many, many government agencies. I will say this, that I believe Israel's ministry gets it. In other words, the budget which is being voted on this week does not reflect the priorities of the professionals. It reflects priorities of the Minister of Finance and his partners in the coalition who are pushing for this sort of an agenda. But with the previous government, and I had several meetings with the Director General of Ministry. I'm feel free to that in matters involving, I should put employment. If you can link a policy that says, yeah, we'll encourage you to, we'll give you support for your kid to go, for example, to daycare, but you have to work. There is broad support for those kind of policies, and I think we can find ways to create a government. And it's a nudge, because somebody who is ideologically committed to having a large family, that's their values. I have no interest being in a country like China. I think it's ethically untenable. Ultimately, it's a boomerang policy. But I think there are ways that the government can create clear indications that, when you have now maybe a new government objective of a stable population, that has different kinds of implications in terms of the economic incentives that we give citizens in all kinds of realms of life. So that's what I think we have to. I think that there is a growing consensus. I can tell you that I've done surveys with my doctoral students and see there is a shift. Israel is starting to hear more and more. The press has become very active talking about this high density situation. And people feel every single day in terms of the road rage that we see on the highways, the violence, the fact that our crowded classrooms also produce children who are sometimes very angry. And I think the wake-up call, certainly for the large cities, I did 2 surveys with ultra-Orthodox community about what it's like to be involved in, and I will say, first of all, that they are less sensitive to it, at least in their answers they give social scientists about living in crowded conditions. But they did feel that it was very difficult to live, 7-8 people in a 3 or 4 bedroom house.
We've been talking this whole time about Israel as kind of like this monolithic thing, and population density as monolithic. But of course, as one of our audience members pointed out, Alan Gale, the central Israel looks very different from the periphery of Israel, what we call the north and the south. To what extent is the problem really limited to a particular area of the country, and to what extent could moving things around address the challenge? And that's a question for either of you.
I think here, first of all, I of course, I fully share Professor Tal major concerns. However, I would suggest a number of distinctions. First of all, between the short and mid-term and the long term. I mean, there are certain objectives that in the short term cannot be obtained. Fertility is high, and it will continue to be high for the next predictable 10, 20, 30 years based on the current population structure, a population which, as a consequence of high fertility and many children who were born, is young. And therefore, many young people will become young adults, and there will be a wave of big numbers of new families, and therefore a chain of new children. This is certainly certain to happen, and so no illusion. Israel growth rate will continue to be high. When we speak of high, we are now in the range of 2% a year, which is incredibly high internationally, although it may look like a small number, but it is very high. And this will continue unquestionably. Therefore, in the meantime, I would focus, if I could give policy suggestions on population distribution. And you just mentioned the North and the South, but especially the South. I will give you a personal account. I once was flying toward the US Southwest, and all of a sudden I was leaping a little bit, and I got up and I see the desert of the Negev. Okay, I see the green spots, but the violet mountains. I mean, the purple mountains and the brown ground, and I think, well, I am on the Negev. No, I think I am, well, where I was over Arizona. I was landing into Phoenix, Arizona. Now, Phoenix, Arizona is identical morphologically to the Negev. The difference is that Phoenix, Arizona has 3 to 4 million inhabitants, and Beersheba has 250,000 in exactly the same landscape. There is no water, and I mean, agriculture has to find ways, creative ways to succeed. So what I'm saying is that we still have a lot of empty space in the South, not unlimited, because there are already land uses which are complicated, but we might first of all give priority to expanding the Israeli presence in the South, and therefore somewhat alleviate the terrible density in the center, in the greater Tel Aviv area primarily. And so that could absorb easily 1, 2, and even 3 million people at the current level of fertility. But this has to be done. I mean, someone has to plan. Unfortunately, when I look at the regional population projections done by the appropriate Israeli government branches, I see that they continue to project as is. That is, Tel Aviv will grow, and Jerusalem will grow less, and Beersheba will grow even less. This is a tragic mistake. We have to change completely the structure of population distribution. And so this is a partial cure to the problem of density. In the longer run, of course, we have to invent a totally different model. And then here, clearly, my own opinion, and I presume Professor Tal is not distant from that, is the greater productivization and access to work, and therefore to independent income by several sectors of the Israeli population which are not there. And we are talking especially of the men, not the women, the men within the Haredi sector, and the women among the Arab sector. So there are sectors who are not producing income to themselves, and therefore the fertility creates poverty. And so this is a national problem, because the state has to subsidize poverty, and it creates a lot of imbalances and also a lot of discontent. Now, I wish to...
So, Sergio, your solution might be to market the Negev as Phoenix. You might have more luck if you marketed it as Las Vegas, which not too long ago had zero population, and now is one of the fastest growing American metropolitan areas. But Professor Tal, you're muted, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I said I'd stick with this Phoenix over Las Vegas any day. I think it's a better. I just came by, I gave a talk in Phoenix last month, and was very impressed. It's actually got some beautiful natural areas. It's a problem because, you know, when I came out with my book, several times I was asked to speak with Professor de la Perla with the note that we would probably be partners in debate, and I find myself agreeing with him far too much, and that doesn't give a very good show for the audience. But on this case, he's spot on. As somebody who spent most of his adult life either teaching in the Negev or living there, as I've lived there for many, many years, I've often felt that way, and I can speak as a politician that our party, the Blue and White Party, has as a goal. It seems like a very modest goal, but it's maybe impossible to attain, that 25% of the population should live in the Galilee in the north, 25% in the Negev, and 50% in the Tel Aviv, Jerusalem corner in the central. If we would get to that, it would be a great improvement. The problem is that just like we don't want to impose a one-child policy, we don't want to do what was in the state of Israel originally. When somebody had come off the boat, they put him on a truck and send him down to Yerucham, ready or not. And today people have volition, and that's a good thing. But people vote with their feet. My daughters were raised in the south, in the desert. They love the stars. They love to walk barefoot on the kibbutz, all that stuff. But they want to live in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. My daughter's starting at Hebrew University next year. So here she's moving over to the competition. But the point is that they haven't been voting with their feet. And we have to find a way to make these land areas more compelling. And here again, we can do that with tax incentives. We can make maybe more housing more attractive. Certainly, at the end of the day, it's occupational stuff, but it's a great irony. I was for many years a professor at Ben Gurion University, and they upgraded the train from Beersheba to Tel Aviv, so it could really be a fast train, and that way some people could live in Beersheba and still enjoy life in Tel Aviv and go see the opera and the concerts and everything. And what happened? About half the university faculty immediately moved to Tel Aviv because they could get down there in 50 minutes on a train. And that is the challenge that we have as a nation. If we want to have this more logical distribution of population, unfortunately, climate change is not going to make it easier. Israel's a hot spot, and it's pretty hot. I did many, many summers in the Arava. It's a challenge. I think it's much nicer than Tel Aviv, but these are things. Give people quality of life; they will move to the Negev. We haven't succeeded in doing that yet.
I'm glad you brought up climate change. Go ahead.
I have a creative idea. Bring to Beersheba the Phoenix basketball team, which is a very good one. And then, of course, you need to have a superb philharmonic orchestra. I mean, think more seriously of the fact that, as you mentioned, Alon, the quality of life, you can do it. I mean, there is, of course, an excellent university, and there is also a high-tech hub in the area. So things can be done. But the thinking is that people don't want to give up on quality of life. And in Israel, the quality of culture is very high. Of course, sports is an interesting function. And give that big metropolitan center the same quality of life that you have now in the center of the country. Unfortunately, at the moment, this is not the case, but this is a way of thinking. But then I wanted to make another consideration, which again stresses the problem. When we do population projections, and of course, population projections are an exercise. It is not prophecy, but they are highly reliable. In Israel, we have a very good Central Bureau of Statistics, and we at the universities also do good work. You see what is going to happen during the next, say, 25 years. We know more or less that in 2050, most of those who live today will live also in 2050. This is the rule.
We hope. I surely hope so, and I wish you the same.
So you look at the difference between the numbers now and the numbers then, and also the distribution by subpopulations, and you discover one thing, for example, which to me is quite amazing. I've an article in print appearing soon at Beersheba, by the way, in which I say this, of the additional about 2 million young people below the age of 18, we expect to have another 2 million more young people as compared to now by 2050. Of these 2 million, about 2/3 are expected to be Haredim. It is about 2/3 of the additional investment you wish to have in education, schools, structures, teachers, pencils, in theory, should go to the Haredi sector just to keep with the pace of population growth. So this is a fact that is going to happen probably because the population projections are quite reliable in a span of 20, 25 years. The question is what kind of education these people will get, at what kind of premises before you're entering or not entering the labor force, and therefore contribution or lack of contribution to producing a GNP, which is sustainable for Israel. So these are crucial things, but we know a lot in terms of what's going to happen to Israeli society. And so our politicians have to take decisions which will be, of course, compatible with the interest of the collective.
Do you think that economic forces could drive some of this growing population to the south? I mean, Tel Aviv is one of the world's most expensive cities. The south is still one of the few places in Israel where real estate is relatively affordable. One of the drivers of settler growth in the West Bank in Yehuda and Shomron has been population growth and the relative cost of the lower relative cost of real estate there.
This is something which I think about a lot, and I believe that is a key. I think also when you think about the Haredi community, which is much more, how should I put it, top down in the way communities make decisions. With the fact that a rabbi said we're going to make Arad a population center, now a third of the people living in Arad, it'll be over very soon. Arad will be an ultra-Orthodox city. These are things which matter as well. I would also add that there is a point of view, I remember it was expressed by Meirav Arlozorov, the chief economic writer for Haaretz and the Marker, that the Haredi birth rate is to some extent a function of their economic model for housing. When a young couple gets married, both sides come up with about 50% of the initial down payment. They get some kind of hole in the wall to get them through the first couple of years, and eventually they move up. But with the large families and the intense poverty rate that they face, those monies are not available. And I was astonished. I live in Modi'in. Nearby is a city almost the same size as Modi'in Elite, an ultra-Orthodox city. Houses there are not cheaper than where I live, and they're expensive. They're costing, close to $1 million for a house. That's unimaginable for somebody who's living on a yeshiva bocher salary. I think Bibi Netanyahu closed yesterday to be 2,000 shekels, so a month. So $750 a month will not get you an apartment in Modi'in Elite. And so there will be economic pressures which will, I think, push people to the periphery, as you suggested, but maybe also push them more into the market. And I still would like to hope that as more become integrated, they will not only adopt some of the other cultural norms, but also some of the fertility patterns of their secular cousins.
We only have about 5 minutes left in our conversation. I can't believe we still haven't gotten to this. But Elliot Rabin, one of our audience members, raised this, and it's certainly top of mind for me. Professor Tal, could you tell us about some of the ecological and environmental costs of Israel's population density and population growth?
Well, for sure. I mean, there is not a single area of the environment where we don't see the population pressures manifested. The greatest crises we have ecologically in Israel are both the climate crisis in terms of rising temperatures, the drought, the fire, but more important, our contribution to the global greenhouse gas loading is unacceptable. It's certainly not accepted by the very agreements we've signed. So we have to do something to cut back on our carbon footprint collectively. And Israel has cut down on a per capita level on their emissions. However, the overall emissions have gone up. And that's not very hard to understand. If you cut back your individual emissions at 1% a year, that's a huge achievement, but your population grew by 2%. And every child is born with a God-given carbon footprint. So that's the first area where we feel. But really, I think if we want to see what keeps me up at night is this biodiversity challenge. Israel is blessed with an astonishing richness in its ecosystems, 150 mammal species, thousands of plant species, hundreds of other organisms, and a third of the vertebrates are identified as threatened with extinction in Israel. And that's very simple because it's a basic equation everywhere in the world. More people, less nature. As the habitats become fragmented, highways, cities, animals start being pushed out. And we see it, by the way, in all kinds of bizarre ways. If you go to Haifa, they have a problem there with the wild boars because they used to live up in the hills and they're being encroached on. There are jackals in Tel Aviv. We in Modi'in have hyenas that like to interlopers. But it's very exciting when you see wildlife in the city, but it's not healthy. It's not healthy for the animals, not healthy for the people, but it reflects the fact that in the center of the country, we are really getting to the point where if we don't create ecological corridors very quickly, we're going to have to give up on many of these species. And it's our responsibility as the Jewish people who receive this incredibly blessed land of Israel to be the caretakers and stewards of the animals. So I'm very concerned about that. And yes, I can tell you, I was a deputy chairman of the Jewish National Fund before I became a member of Knesset. And everywhere you turn, where you have a forest and there's an ecological corridor associated with it, there is a city that wants to expand legitimately. Elad is an ultra-Orthodox city. They are very, very crowded. They want to expand. I understand them. But if they destroy the forest next to them, it'll be a huge hit for that central area. And we have to see it everywhere. So we have victories in the city of Modi'in, where I live in. We managed to save the southern areas, and that's very important. But we need to have I think about a 10-year window of opportunity to set aside those lands we need to preserve animals. And we have the same other issues I could talk about. The one area where I would be more sanguine and more optimistic is water. Here are the technological optimists, the Prometheans, if you will, have shown that yes, desalination probably means that if our population was 200 million, we could give them water. We know how to make water cheaply. If we can get the energy equation right and do it without emitting greenhouse gases, then I don't think we have to worry about water, which I think was the original resource challenge that the country had. I'll leave it at that because we don't have much time.
Thank you. We are out of time, and I think that's a great note to end. I want to thank everybody for attending, and particularly our panelists, Sergio de la Pergola and Alon Tal. This is the last of our Israel 75 events. It's been great having people attend, and I hope that you next time won't just zoom in to these discussions about Israel, but will come and visit yourself, whether or not you settle here. If you do, there's, look at the South. Thank you. And a particular thank you to you both. Thanks, Sergio. Thank you, Alon.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a nice night.
Good day, Litraot.